Hi everyone, Woniya here with Buckskin Revolution and Season 6 of Alone. And I am ready to talk about the final episode of Alone. It has taken me a minute to get here. It'll be 2 weeks tomorrow from the day that the episode came out. And it has been quite a whirlwind ever since it came out. There was a lot to process, and knowing that for the first time I actually get to really talk about everything that happened has been big. And I've also been getting so many communications, so many people reaching out to me. So it's taken me a minute to get to this, partly because I just needed to think about it and process it for a while. And that's one of the things that you don't really see as an audience member is how much, and I've spoken about it before, but gets left out of each of these episodes. So those last few days out there, the days that this episode covers, were so deep and so profound for me. And I had so many big epiphany, aha moments, and so many moments of just epic beauty, and so many things I was really attached to you getting to see from that time. And none of those were what was shown in the episode. So it was definitely really disappointing for me. And again, it just took me a little time to come to terms with and be ready to talk about all of this stuff. And certainly it's true, and we see it a lot in this episode, the degree to which the editing can really play with the stories and with the emotions of the viewers. And I'll talk about that more as we go on. But this was one of those episodes that definitely felt really true to me. Particularly as we've been seeing in the last couple episodes with this whole thing of like Woniya and Jordan, and she's, doing so good and he's starting to fail, and what's going to happen, and giving this impression again that Jordan is in just as dire a situation physically as I am. And again, that was definitely not the case. And even in this episode, you really don't get a clear idea of what's going on under my parka. But it's the first time that I was starting to be really aware and really concerned about that. And so the first you see of me is kind of a pan in, and you see some of my snowy trails there, and then you see me in my cabin. And I love that this shot shows some of those things that I really wanted you to see that you didn't get to. One of the things you see is my quiver, the new quiver that I made for myself in my last couple weeks out there, and that is made out of willow and strips of birch bark. And I made that because the quiver that I made to bring out there was really big and cumbersome, and I made it big on purpose so I would have extra materials. But the problem with it is it was made as a back quiver, because I didn't realize that we had this big pack that we had to carry with all of our camera equipment and some safety and some communications equipment. So there wasn't room for me to have both my quiver and the basket and the backpack, which was a problem. So I made this basket quiver that was a side quiver, so it wasn't in the way of my backpack, and also gave me really easy access to my arrows. So you can see that in the background, which is awesome. Another thing you can see is kind of my kitchen setup. You can see my little canister, my birch bark canister that was my kitchen utensils, and my spatula and my spoon. Also in that canister I would keep some bones for picks for bone marrow, getting bone marrow out of the bones. And you see that there. And then also you see the burn bowl that I'm working on. And you can also see one of the things that happened to my boot, which I think was around maybe like day 60 or so, but I was constantly every night drying out my footwear. It kept me warm and toasty during the day, but certainly frost from sweat from my feet would accumulate in my footwear over the course of the day. So every night I was drying those meticulously. One of those nights I turned around to grab something behind me, and when I turned back, my boot had fallen into the fire, and a bunch of the leather had crinkled and singed, and it was definitely a like, oh God moment. But it turns out that it crinkled and it certainly damaged the boot, but it didn't make it unwearable. There was part of me that almost wished that my boot had been more damaged in the incident, because my plan was to pull apart my quiver and repair my boot with my quiver, and that would have been really cool to show you guys if they had shown it. But I didn't have to do it because it turned out that I was still able to lace up my boot just a little bit looser, but you can see the singed part of my boot. Also, you can see the repair that I made to those boots because my knees were soaking through when I would crouch for hours doing traps in that cold snow, and the heat from my legs would melt the snow and I would get these wet patches on the furs of my boots. So I wanted something that was waterproof, and beaver fur is waterproof because they're an aquatic animal, right? So I pulled out the beaver fur and rearranged the other furs and put those on my boots so that I had these patches on my knees that I could kneel on. You can actually see how my parka is kind of weird and bunchy in the back, and that's because it was never quite the same again once I pulled those beaver furs out. It was still warm, but it was bunchy and weird and not as comfortable. Still felt like it was a good call. Another thing you can see in that footage is you can really get a look at my hands and how just soot black my hands are. At that point, everything in my world was just covered with thick creosote from the smoke, because whenever I would leave my shelter, I would put punky birchwood on there that was part rotten, and so it would smoke and smolder for a long time, and so that way I could leave for hours and come back and still have coals, and then I can just throw fresh wood on the fire. So everything is covered in soot, including my hands. And of course, at that point, it's way down below zero and there's no liquid water anywhere. So washing my hands, not gonna happen. So that, and by that point, just the deep depletion and no fat in my body and so little protein coming in, my skin was definitely taking a beating, especially from having my hands out there to be doing my traps in those temperatures. I just had deep cracks all over my hands. And then you hear me talking about buttered biscuits. And you know, it's really interesting the foods that you think about when you've been out there starving for so long. And the thing is that that footage was actually from when I knew I was leaving, and I was actually allowing myself to think about the food that I would get when I come out. I definitely avoided thinking specifically about such things when I was out there because my whole reality was where I was. I didn't want to be thinking about other places and what I would do when I would get out. But at that point in the journey, that was starting to shift for me, right? I was starting to come to terms with something different going on in my body. So I had that day that I was really successful trapping. The thing is those successful trapping days were getting really few and far between, because at this point the weather is getting really stormy, and stormy weather was really bad for my trapping. A bunch of different things. One, it was so cold that the trees were freezing in place, so I wasn't getting the spring I needed from my spring poles once it got cold. Also, those stormy winds would often set off my traps, because to trap rabbits and squirrels, you have to have really light trigger mechanisms, right? Because they're not very strong animals. The strength of the wind was as strong as the rabbit. So in stormy weather, I would go out and so many of my traps had been sprung just by the motion of the trees and the wind. So that was one of the things making trapping so much harder. And then also, of course, we see later in the episode, I think, the fox moving back in. So, you know, it came through, it went away. I had a period where there weren't foxes, and then they would come back in. And I think at this point, they were just traveling a lot to get as far as they needed, to get as much food as they needed. So they would just pop in occasionally, and then trapping was just not happening. So at that point, I'm holding out for a couple of things, right? Certainly one of the major things I'm holding out for is the coming of the ice. So when the ice first started freezing over, I was so excited because it meant soon I was going to be able to ice fish. So at first, the ice was 3 or 4 inches thick, and I was using the butt end of my folding saw, which is a Silky Katana Boy, and it's solid metal back here. And so I would grab this and just use it as a chisel to chisel my way through the ice. And it took a minute. Certainly it took longer than it would have with an axe, but it was totally doable, right? So I had a little hole that was just a couple feet from the rocks on my shore, so if I fell through, it wasn't a big deal. I was, you know, crawling distance to shore. And I beat a hole, and it was pretty quick, and then I sawed that hole larger, and then I had a scoop, a basket that I had made with an open weave, and that was attached to a stick, so I could scoop out the ice, because ice left in that hole would form little more crystals. They'd be a nucleus for more ice crystals to form around, and it would freeze up. So I kept that hole open for days using the saw, that basket scoop, and then when I was done getting water, I would heap spruce boughs over it and then snow on top of that to keep it insulated. Then, finally, I got the thumbs up that the ice was thick enough to get out onto the ice, but I had to be really careful, and I had to make some safety equipment in order to be able to get out there, just in case the ice cracked, to spread out my weight and have something to be able to grab hold of to pull myself out, should it be necessary. Two things happened right at that point. One was a crazy storm came in. The temperature dropped so far and the winds were so intense and the ice was so exposed. And then right at that same time, right before that storm hit, was a time when I had a couple really successful days trapping. So I actually had plenty of food to eat. 3 meals a day, just for a brief period of time. So those things combined had me say, okay, I'm not going to go out onto the ice right now. It would be a death wish. It is so cold and that wind is so fierce. That would be a serious frostbite danger. So I have food. I could use a little R&R and some time to just put some nourishment back into my body. So I'm not going to go onto the ice. I'm going to cook the food that I have, and then once this storm passes, then I'll go out and I'll make a hole in the deeper water and I can be ice fishing. Great. So 3 days later, I go out to the ice, and that is the evening that you see there. And that ice had gone from 3-4 inches thick in 3 days to 18 inches thick. Now, this tool was fine for getting through thinner ice. But the fact that I waited for those 3 days meant that ice was impenetrable. It was so thick. It took me so long just to get 9 inches down. And at that point, the thing is I hadn't had calories for a while. That food was gone. It was, 3 days of the storm, and the first day and a half I was eating pretty good, but I knew that the amount of calories it was going to take me to get through that ice was going to be hard to make up for with ice fishing. And I have done ice fishing, but I'm no expert in ice fishing, so I did my best to choose a spot. So after days of that intense storm, the ice, which had been kind of white and all of these beautiful hoarfrost crystals on it, but opaque and hard to see through, well, that storm had just scoured that ice and polished it so it was like a mirror surface and I could look straight down. And so I walked out from shore, and this was when I absolutely knew that I had done the right thing to just stop wasting my time fishing, because I could walk out hundreds of feet and see that it was still shallow as anything every direction from where I was. So it took me getting out, several hundred feet before I got to any deep water. So the way I chose my spot for my hole was out where the water was deep, but not way far out into the deep water, so around some natural topography. So I was maybe 40 feet off of the island and 30 feet from where it had gotten very, very deep. That's where I dug my hole, thinking that that would be a good spot for the fish to be hanging out. However, at that point, it wasn't happening. My tool was insufficient. My body was just too far gone to have enough calories to give to make getting through that ice make any sense. So I had to give up the idea of ice fishing, which was the one thing I'd been holding out for. But here is the thing that I'm so disappointed that you didn't get to see about that night, because I was having a magnificent time out there. Yes, it was frustrating to be out there working so hard on this kind of last hope I had for calories and have it not happen. That said, I was nowhere near as disappointed as you might think. And you can hear this when I'm saying, oh, that's the Arctic. It'll get you every time. I'm disappointed, but I'm not totally crestfallen. And that's a couple different things going on. One is, at that point, I said my last hope, but I had one other thing that I was holding out a hope for. And that is, I knew where I believed a beaver lodge was off of another island. So early on, I think it's maybe episode 4 or 5, you actually see me out, and it's when I see the moose shed antlers, and they do a voiceover of me talking about moose sign, but it's not actually moose sign I'm seeing right there. There's a pile of clipped alder branches and a thin trail that goes out into the water. That was beaver sign, and I was clearly saying it was beaver sign, but it got changed in the editing. There were beaver in the area, and what they were doing was clipping vegetation and bringing it over and making a little raft in the water. And I could see that that raft of vegetation was over near the shore of an island. So those beavers weren't accessible to me when the water was liquid. They were over on an island, but I was hoping that once the ice froze, I could get to that island and potentially get away into the beaver lodge or through the ice and trap some beaver. So I wasn't completely crestfallen with the ice fishing not happening. But the thing is, the moment that I was really, really hoping that you would get to see was just the absolute magnificence of that night out on the ice. Yes, it was disappointing to not get through it. Very disappointing indeed. But that was one of the most astounding nights of my life. It is burned into my memory. So once I decided that it wasn't worth the calories, and even with a lot of calories, I still might not even be able to get through the ice, I set down my stuff and I went out across the ice to explore, because you can see the colors in the sky when I'm crouching there on the ice. It was the most amazing sunset. And I'm sure you've seen spectacular sunsets in your life, but this was like nothing you've ever seen, because I'm standing on this ice that is just mirror smooth. The entire lake is this reflecting surface, and the magnificence of that sunset, not just in the sky, but reflected and underfoot, like you are standing on the sunset. It was amazing. And then I went further out onto the ice and reached this point in deeper water where the ice had really cracked and shifted because of all of the deep pressure of the ice forming. Something that happens is it cracks. And I was in this area where the whole lake was like a giant jigsaw puzzle, because the cracks that had happened meant that there were all of these pieces, maybe like 10 to 30 foot square, and then the pressures of the ice had heaved them all, so they were all sticking out at different angles to one another. So each one was like this amazing mirror surface at a different angle to the sunset, so each was catching a different part of the sky and a different color. It was the most epically beautiful thing I have ever seen, and I was literally screaming and shouting in joy and exultation just after this big blow of not getting through the ice. And then as I'm standing out there experiencing that right over this beautiful island that I had been staring at for all of my weeks out there and finally had gotten to go to and explore, right over that island rose this moon that was exactly half of a moon, exactly vertical, rising up through those clouds into that amazing sky with all of those sunset colors reflected at me. It was amazing. And right in that moment I said, you know what? If I get pulled tomorrow, if I have to leave tomorrow, that is okay, because I got this night out on the ice, and this is the most magnificent experience I have ever had. It was like the favorite night of my life. And they didn't show it. You didn't get to see it. What you got to see was me failing to get through the ice and bleeps. I don't believe I was actually bleeping. I think those were inserted, and I never actually was cussing. Because you can kind of see in my mannerism, I'm like, well, I'm not getting through it. Arctic, huh? You know, like I'm not all crestfallen. I'm certainly not upset and cussing. So that was disappointing.